Welcome, everyone. This is Pat Bailey, Director of Training at Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. We'd like to welcome you to our 2017 Virtual Summit Series featuring some of the best workshops during our 2016 Workplace Summit. Today we're going to be talking about LGBTQ marketing, what makes us different, what makes us the same. This is a broadcast audio, and you should be hearing us through your computer, so make sure you turn your headsets up or your volume up on your computer. If you have a problem hearing, go ahead and chat in, and we'll be able to give you some support there. We can also use the chat in with questions. So check on the left side of your computer. There's a chat box. You can put your comments and respond to polls that way. When a poll does come up, select your answers and then hit submit, and you'll see that. And again, we will be recording this session, and the slides will be available after the end so you can get that. So let me go ahead and make a few announcements here. Our last virtual summit series is going to be on February 28th. On Who is Your Inclusive ERG, featuring Deloitte will be sharing with us some of the expertise. Our February 23rd, a monthly town call, will be about LGBT generations and leadership in the workplace. March 21st, we're going to do a new course for us. It's a Building Bridges to LGBT Cultural Competency 101. It's a 1-hour fee-for-service webinar that gives you a chance to get an introduction. If you've got companies and groups that you're working with that just want to get started on seeing what the information is around cultural competency, that's the workshop to take. The registration will be up shortly for that. Our executive forum is happening the end of March. And then we'll do that finishing up here in San Francisco with our Momentum Leadership Gala. If you know out executives or out young professionals, then you go ahead and sign up for that course. The link is there. And then we're going to do our town call in March on self-ID. And don't forget the summit. It's coming up October 9th through 12th. And there's a couple of April dates that are added in there. The full Building Bridges, which is a 3-part webinar series, is going to start on April 3rd. And on April 27th, we're going to look at gender expression. We do have a question for you as our audience. We've got about 148 on the call so far. And so here's a poll for you to answer. We do a lot of classroom and online facilitation, and we're trying to get a feel for what are your training needs? What's your company looking for? What topics do you want to think about? So select those, all that apply. You can select any that apply. And they are coming in now, and it looks like we've got about a third of the audience has responded so far, and it looks like developing ally programs is high there. Basic LGBT cultural competency, recruit, retain, promotion, unconscious bias, creating and growing your ERG, and about halfway there. So just click on the answers and hit submit so you can see the results there. We'll give this just a second to get a few more responses in. The information, I see a couple of chats coming in about the fee for the courses. We can get back with you on those and let you know. But they'll be up on our website, outandequal.org, and go under Learn and click on Out and Equal University. So with that, looks like we've got just about 2/3 of the audience in, with the number one being developing ally programs. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our presenters for today, and Tom and David are going to give us their expertise, and I'll turn it over to you. Go ahead.
And thanks very much, Pat. I really appreciate the introduction, and we're really excited to continue our long-time alliance with Out and Equal. I'm going to give us a little bit of time for everyone to join while I begin the conversation here. So the topic is diversity marketing. I'm going to introduce myself, and Dave will introduce himself in a minute. But just as sort of an orientation to why we're having this conversation, from our perspective, working with companies for almost 25 years now, we've noticed that a lot of companies are doing a lot of great work on what we call in-reach. In other words, getting your best practices in order, which is awesome. And we really commend every company that's involved with Out and Equal for stepping up to the plate and really being genuine and authentic in LGBTQ. But we find that a lot of companies aren't really leveraging your internal being ready to outreach. So that's really the topic of today's conversation, is to really understand the diversity within LGBT, how we can look at LGBT as kind of a spectrum of communities within an umbrella of one acronym of LGBT. But we can also look at LGBT within the bigger picture of diversity. So we'll be moving through this relatively quickly. We have a lot of research that we're going to be talking about that will back up our conversation, since that's our specialty. And we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So thanks again to Pat. Thanks for Out and Equal for making this conversation possible. And now we'll get into a little bit of introduction about ourselves and our company before we jump right in. I'm Tom Roth. I'm the guy on the left. And I started community marketing and insights back in 1992. And that's a lot of years in gay years, especially as an LGBT-specific company. There really aren't many pioneers like us around. And we're really proud of the fact that we've made a major contribution to the LGBT conversation through our market research and communications and training and so forth. And Dave, if you're there, why don't you chime in with a little bit about you?
And my name is David Paisley. I'm the Senior Research Director here at CMI. I've actually been with the company for well over 20 years. So I have a lot of experience doing LGBT market research. And our company as a whole, we've probably done about 200 to 300 LGBT-specific market research products for a wide variety of different types of companies and government. So I come at this sort of as an aggregate of all my experience as I'm talking.
And of course, we'd be remiss not acknowledging that today is Valentine's Day. So we wish everybody on the call a very happy, healthy Valentine's Day for you and your loved ones. And before we jump in, I know this is typically the last slide, but I know a lot of people probably will have to jump off the call sooner rather than at the end. So if you'd like a copy of this presentation, links to download our research studies and so forth, I will be sending out an email follow-up. I'm sure Pat will be too. But if you want to contact us directly, it's pretty simple, tom@cmi.info. And just send an email with a subject line follow-up, whatever. But it doesn't have to be too elaborate, and we will get all those links over to you. So what we're going to talk about today in our brief time with you, I'm going to give you a high-level review of who we are and why we're making this presentation, why we're basically qualified and asked to do that. And then we're going to get into a couple really important topics. First of all is LGBTQ. How are we the same? What are the circumstances when we speak as one voice, when you can market to us as one community? And then after that, we're going to kind of, unpackage that. We're going to look at LGBTQ as segments within a community and how some companies and organizations are really successfully identifying opportunities underneath the LGBTQ umbrella. In other words, looking at, for example, LGBT African Americans or the transgender market. And then we're going to look at LGBTQ within the bigger diversity conversation. How does LGBTQ fit in when you're looking at the African American market, the Hispanic American market, and so forth? How does the LGBT segment fit into that bigger picture conversation? And we'll wrap up with some ways that we can continue the conversation, some conferences that are coming up and so forth, and certainly plenty of time for questions and answers. So first of all, just a couple slides about who we are and some resources that you have available to you. As we get going, just so that you understand our perspective, we've actually been doing this 25 years. We are an LGBT-specific market research and communications company. Our focus is on consumer research, although we do B2B research as well. We provide our own panel of 70,000 LGBT consumers, and those consumers are drawn from partnerships with about 300 LGBT media organizations and events across North America and increasingly around the world. And like every research company out there, we do surveys, we do focus groups, we do interviews and so forth, and those are interpreted into marketing plans. Just a few of the diverse clients that we've been fortunate to work with. For example, right now we're doing a study for iHeartMedia about media consumption. We're also doing a study for the U.S. Census about communications and terminology in census work. We're doing a study for the Hawaii Tourism Authority in North America, as well as several Asian countries and Australia. And these are, like I said, just kind of a snapshot of some of the companies that we've had the great privilege of getting to work with over the past year, as well as government institutions, which is kind of an interesting and hopefully growing segment of our world. And off of our website, you have the access to several studies that we're going to be referencing here. And that cmi.info website, after the call, you can go there and click on research and downloads. And they're literally available for free, and we highly recommend doing that. If you're interested in understanding not only the big picture of LGBTQ as a market, but also segments within LGBT, you can do well by clicking and downloading some of these reports and understanding the nuance within LGBT. So you have our LGBT community survey, which we'll be referencing today in our talk. For those in tourism and hospitality, we've been doing our tourism study since 1994. We're going to be doing our 22nd study this year. We also have we're very proud of our first ever African American Black LGBT community survey. A big part of our workshops and conversations are about, again, the diversity within LGBT, and you can understand a very important market segment within LGBT. And those who are looking at diversity, you'll see that there's some cross-reference, which is really interesting, between LGBT and African American. And if you're looking after both LGBT and African American, it might make some sense to understand the LGBT African American community. Weddings and honeymoons is a big topic for many of our clients, so we've done a great study on same-sex weddings that compares not only LGBT, or covers not only LGBT, but also looking at mainstream comparisons. We're proud of our partnership with Greater Fort Lauderdale. We did a study on transgender travel issues. Even if you're not in the travel industry, that would be great to understand some of the concerns and issues around transgender consumers. We also partner every year with NGLCC, the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, on a B2B study. So if you're in the B2B, business-to-business world, you can download that report. And last but not least, we also are very proud of our first ever LGBT China community survey, where we surveyed over 8,000 LGBT Chinese, the largest community survey of its kind, and that is also quite an eye-opener. So let's move on. Now that you know a little bit about us, let's look at our approach to research and why we can talk about diversity within LGBT. Many studies that you look at out there about the LGBT market, I'm using finger quotes here, are about all LGBTs as an aggregate. And we think that's problemsome because there really is no LGBT market as a singular entity. Just because, well, if you think about it, men are different than women as consumers. Men purchase differently, men have different motivations in purchases, men consume different media, do different things in their spare time and so forth than women. So why then could we even think of a gay and lesbian market? It's like saying a male and female market. We really need to understand the differences within LGBT. And our clients have found, honestly, and this is a big takeaway, that the more focused you can be within LGBT, the better the return on investment. Everything else is kind of a shotgun. If you're trying to be all things to all LGBT, it's expensive, it's cumbersome, and really not that effective. But if you can outreach to the LGBT African American community, for example, through their websites and their media and their organizations and events, think of the impact you have and the ability to move market share. So that's why we in our surveys ask, not only are you gay or lesbian, but we ask all these different opportunities to express who we are as an identity, both as sexual identity and sexual orientation and gender identity. And this list is pretty comprehensive. You'll see it's not like you see on typical surveys, but we get a lot of really positive feedback from the community by being authentic in this way and really understanding what's going on out there. And because of that, we're able to target for our clients. So for example, if a bank wants us to focus on LGBTs in the Southeast, we're able to do that, or lesbian family members in the Northeast, if they want us to talk to millennials, if they want to get a sense of LGBT families or marriage and so forth, we're able to do that. So now let me turn it over to Dave, because the conversation here is how are we the same and how are we different, and how does that apply to our understanding of LGBTQ? And this is really the nuts and bolts. I really went over all the previous slides just to kind of get to this point so you understand who we are and what our approach is to communications. So Dave, let me turn it over to you to tell our folks here on the call, how are we the same as an LGBTQ market?
Great. And we're going to go through this as two approaches. We're going to talk a little bit about how the LGBT market is the same and how we're different. And this first section about how we are the same has important marketing implications, because these are ways in which I think as an LGBTQ market, we do have some similarities, and keeping these in mind, again, everyone's an individual, but keeping these broad concepts in mind actually can be helpful for marketing. So the first thing I want to mention after the recent election is that we are a reasonably coherent political bloc. Of course, there are LGBT Republicans, but obviously within LGBT, we actually do have a reasonably coherent LGBTQ political bloc and voting bloc. And that's important for a lot of reasons to understand. I think it's actually one of the things that really binds us, and one of the things that actually does influence how corporations outreach to the LGBT community for a number of reasons. Probably the most prominent one is that I think if you're going to outreach to the LGBT market, the concept of best practices and getting your own corporate house in order becomes really important. And of course, that's what Out and Equal is really about, and has done such a great job over all these years in helping corporations get their internal practices in order. And I'm not going to go over all of these different sort of pointers, and that's all about what Out and Equal does. But what's most important to me is the next slide, and it's one thing that makes LGBTQ sort of unique, is that when we ask the question, which approaches have the biggest impact on influencing your purchasing decision, the LGBT community is really unique and probably different than maybe some ethnicity communities or gender markets or other types of markets out there, and that we care really deeply about how corporations treat their own employees. So what I think is really unique about a slide like this is that when we ask what has the most impact, consistently when we ask this in different ways, the concept of employment policies, supporting LGBT organizations and charities, supporting political clauses, using LGBT inclusive mainstream media, actually scores higher than concepts like advertising in the LGBT websites or advertising in print media. And I think that's really interesting and something that's really unique to our community. And it's partially because of being politically attacked, that as we speak in that voice politically, it's important that corporations back us up, and we respond to those corporations that really are on the forefront of LGBT equality. Now, that's not to say that advertising is not important, because obviously for all the corporations that have lots of LGBT in reach, you have to find ways of letting the general consumer know about your good work. And that's where sponsorship really comes into play. But it does really emphasize the importance of actually telling people out there how much you're doing. I can't emphasize that enough. I work with a lot of corporations that have great internal policies, but they really struggle with how to tell corporations about their positive internal policies. But it's something that needs to be done and can be done in a number of ways. Now, these next series of slides, 3 slides, I'll go through the slides and I'll tell you what the point of it is that we've asked a number of slides, like this was first one. If you had to describe yourself or your personality in 3 words, which would we use? So LGBT community members, we describe ourselves as being things like friendly and outgoing and smart and loving. I think what's really interesting about this slide is that if we look at gay and bisexual men and lesbian and bisexual women, they actually use the top 9 words are the exact same that the male and females within our community describe themselves. Also, if we go on to the next slide, if we say, tell us the 3 words that best describe the qualities of your partner or spouse, again, the top 9 words, how we describe our partner and spouse, are exactly the same, and we're using things like loving and caring and smart and intelligent and loyal. When we ask LGBT parents if you had the experience of describe the experience of being an LGBT parent in 3 words, the words that come up are probably not too different than a lot of words that all parents use. Things like challenging and rewarding and amazing and difficult and fun. All those are words probably that all parents will use. So why do I put out these 3 slides? I think one thing that we always got to be really careful about in LGBT market outreach is that sometimes we over-stereotype the LGBT community in our advertising and our communications. I think it's interesting when we ask ourselves to describe ourselves or describe our partners or describe what it means to be a parent, the word fabulous just never comes up, right? And I think that's important because I know in our qualitative work, one of the biggest complaints I have from many people in the LGBT community is that the ads they seem really stereotypical to them and they don't relate to them, right? So I think that's a challenge sometimes for many in the advertising field. And it's something I would actually challenge you, and I would actually have you challenge your ad agencies, because I think sometimes ad agencies are always trying to be really cutting edge. And I've seen a lot of really cutting edge ads over the last couple of years, but the ones I remember are the ones that really connect with us on the emotional level. It's not the ones that are connecting with us on the stereotype level. So it's something to really connect with. Another thing I want to talk about that, again, makes us the same is that, not surprising, men and women and transgender, young and all, we wouldn't expect all of us to be using the same media. You know, young people don't read a lot of media. They're often online. They're using social media. Print media is a little bit more popular with baby boomers. Men and women in transgender community often read different types of media. But there are some areas in which you can actually find the entire community. First of all, online. Facebook is actually really strong across all generations and across all genders. So I think that's something to keep in mind, and the way that Facebook really allows you to target the person that you're trying to advertise to. We find at least that Facebook can be really, really effective in reaching the broad community, but also targeting. Another thing on the lower part of this I like to point out is that Pride is actually still very, very popular across all generations and all genders. Now, I think this is really interesting. The question here is, in the past 12 months, have you participated and went to a Pride event? And about half the community across the board said that they had. I think what's actually most important about this ad, is, this particular chart, is that it's actually going to Pride is actually a little stronger with millennials and baby boomers. Some people have thought that maybe Pride as an event would become less important to millennials just because, you know, times are changing, and in theory, as times change, things will become more LGBT friendly over time. And many people question the relevance of Pride to millennials. But our research really clearly shows that millennials care about Pride quite a bit. And if you ask them, they care about Pride for two reasons. They care about Pride, first of all, because it's one of the few places in the entire LGBT community that they really see the entire community. And that's something that's really important to millennials. One thing millennials will complain about a lot is that sometimes, especially men and women, young and old, you know, segment themselves a little bit in the LGBT community. But one thing they love about Pride is it's the one place that the entire community there is at the same time. And the other thing millennials will tell me is that they like Pride because there's a lot of free stuff. And that's true. Pride is actually a really good event if you're rich or poor. You know, if you have a limited income, there's lots of free stuff to do at Pride. And if you're a millennial and don't have as much money, you can have a great time with a limited budget. So that's another reason millennials may like Pride. Another thing I want to point out is that we can be similar when we look at some purchases. As Tom said earlier, an awful lot of purchases when we look at the LGBT community by segment can be stronger with men and women or the transgender community or young or old or East Coast or West Coast or the many different segments that are out there. But there are a lot of different types of products that are actually pretty equal across the board. I mean, sort of purchasing and owning an auto or major home remodel or purchasing a primary home or condo are actually pretty common across the board. So one thing I really want to say in this discussion of how we are the same and how we are different is that you really need to evaluate your product, because some of the products out there are going to be very specific to a demographic segment, but not all products. There are some products, like, say, retail banking, that everybody uses, and maybe a more general approach sometimes can be okay. All right, next I want to talk a little bit about diversity within LGBT. I'm going to have Tom start on this, and then I'll come back.
Hi, thanks, Dave. That was excellent. I'm going to address a couple questions that have come up as we have been having this conversation, and most of them are just going to be deferring. I'm not going too deep into them. One question is, I never understood what queer is, English not being his or her first language, and that's totally understandable. We really never did define it. In fact, on our website, you'll be able to download a study that we did specifically on the Q in LGBTQ, because funnily enough, even LGBTQ people don't really agree on what the Q means. To many, it means queer. To many, it means questioning. To some, it means both. Sometimes you'll see LGBTQQ, just to kind of emphasize the fact that there are both. Queer is a term that means basically unusual, and it was a very derogatory form of conversation back when I was growing up. I remember my best friend's mother told her kid that she thought I was queer. I didn't even know what it was. It was a derogatory term for homosexual. And younger people have really embraced it, and so the term queer in marketing and advertising, that's a whole other conversation, honestly, and we have a whole workshop specifically on terminology. But younger people are more okay with the Q and the term queer. Women are typically a little bit better with the Q and the term queer. Older gay men are very not happy with companies that use the Q or the term queer, because for them it carries a lot of baggage. And if your market is specifically baby boomer men, then I would avoid using the Q at this point. I think that's changing, but it is a conversation that's good to have. Another asked about trans people. Actually, if you download our survey report, there's a whole section at the end looking specifically at the transgender members of our survey report. Transgender is a very, very important part of our work. We probably have the largest panel of transgender people. We probably do the most transgender specific work out there in terms of consumer research. And I really encourage everybody, especially if you're going to say LGBT, to know what that T means and how it can be authentically communicated. Another is, do you have percentages for compared to heterosexual? I don't know which slide that is. Oh, it was about home remodeling. We don't. There's a lot of general market research out there where you can download and draw your own comparisons, but we really do focus specifically on LGBT research. But there are times when we are able to do general market comparisons, like in our wedding study. If you take a look at that, we have done that. So moving forward, there was another question about polyfamilies. We do ask in our surveys if you are polyamorous, but we have not generated a study specifically or a report specifically on polyfamilies. Something that could be really interesting specifically as we move forward. So what I want to emphasize here is there is no gay market. I remember back in the 90s when we were doing workshops, we would talk about the gay market. And then in the 2000s, we talked about the gay and lesbian market, as if they could be considered homogenous, so to speak. But there really isn't a gay market or a gay and lesbian market or even an LGBT market. And the reason for that is that we really represent a slice of the world's population. You know, if you stereotypically think of, the gay men who go on gay cruises and go to gay bars and read the gay media, that's really a small percentage of the overall population, and everybody's trying to get to those people. So it's an expensive proposition as well. We don't recommend that. We really recommend looking at the diversity within LGBT and understanding the opportunities. You may be very surprised. Some of our clients have us break out through a matrix, men versus women versus transgender identified. We look at generations. We look at all the different ethnicities, and sometimes an opportunity arises that nobody really thought about. So it's really good to do that. So how is diversity part of LGBTQ, and how is LGBTQ part of diversity? And now to kind of unpackage LGBTQ, a lot of our clients are either like the diversity director or the VP of diversity for a major corporation. And over the years, they've been tasked with looking at segments within the overall general market. So let's take a look at our opportunities in the African American market, or let's take a look at opportunities in the senior market or the student market, et cetera. And then as the country has evolved, up until now at least, diversity has started to include LGBTQ. So LGBTQ is now sometimes on the plate of those diversity directors and VPs where it hadn't been before. And that's a lot of our coaching and research, is to help them better understand how LGBTQ fits into that overall diversity conversation at work. But I also want to reemphasize that LGBTQ is part of diversity. So it really goes both ways, that there's diversity within LGBT, and LGBT is part of the bigger picture corporate diversity discussion. Dave?
Great. So getting more about what Tom's saying is, I just say this as an example, and maybe it's inherently obvious, but as consumers, as people that purchase things, these people are not the same. A lesbian couple who's in their 60s and retired and now lives in Sedona, Arizona, is not the same consumer, not the same purchaser as a 22-year-old queer guy with his first job in Manhattan, right? A lesbian couple in Florida that's saving for their children's pending college education is totally different than a single lesbian who's just divorced from a same-sex marriage. Totally different than a transgender 18-year-old entering college. These people as consumers are totally different, and they have to be treated as such, and you need to learn about what really makes sense from both a messaging and product development for each of these different consumers within LGBT. So I'm going to talk about some areas in which we're different now. And I think, as Tom was starting to say, language is a really good way to start. I think one thing that CMI is really known for is that we've been running this particular survey for a very long time, and we've been asked the same question for a long time every year, and that is, the following terms are used by corporate marketing to describe or refer to our communities. How do you feel about them, positive, negative, or neutral? And these are the positive % ratings for these different terms. And I'm going to do generation next, but I want to talk about a couple of these because I think it's really interesting. I mean, we started the survey right when GLBT as a concept started. And it was really interesting as we went from gay and lesbian to the alphabet, is that in the early years it was GLBT. And then we went into this little phase as it progressed where the guys wanted GLBT and the women wanted LGBT. And then slowly LGBT started winning. Now, what's really interesting here is that GLBT, I'm going to say, as a term, has lost, not only with the women, but also with the men. And I really want to be cautious because sometimes I still see ads out there that say GLBT, and I cringe a little bit, because what the qualitative work that we do will say is that when gay men see GLBT, the message they see is that your company is not progressive. That's what they're telling us right now. So it really shouldn't be used. It's sort of a negative word right now. I also want to bring up this concept of gay-friendly versus LGBT-friendly because that really has important messages. So what does it say to call something the gay neighborhood? Well, I'll tell you increasingly, to call your city and go to the gay neighborhood says that lesbians and transgender people are not included, right? So why I bring up that really important message is that I read a lot of websites, and I'm not saying that you can't always use gay or lesbian, that everything has to be LGBT all the time, because sometimes, in language it can get a little bit monotonous if it's all in the same paragraph. But what I am saying is that I've been to websites that talk about their company being gay-friendly and going to the gay neighborhood, and we're a great gay destination, particularly in the travel industry. And I just see the word gay, 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 gay all the time. And I'm going to tell you is that the lesbian, bisexual women and the gender expansive communities are really reacting very negatively to that right now. So you got to be very, very careful about that. So you can see with gay friendly how the guys up here, third down, are okay with that, but then it really drops off, especially with gender expansive folks. Another thing I really want to point out on this particular list is that the concept of rainbow, both as a word and image, is actually decreasing in favorability over time. So you need to be very careful about that. What the qualitative will say about the use of the word rainbow today is that it really should be used in conjunction with pride celebrations. It's quickly becoming more of a symbol for the celebration of pride as opposed to the community as a whole. And it's losing by percentage a little bit every year. And what people will tell us is it just comes off a little bit, a little bit old, a little bit condescending now. So you got to be careful about that in your advertising. I'm not saying you can't use the rainbow. I'm not saying you can't turn your logo into into a rainbow logo. That's all fine, but don't overdo it right now because it's a little bit losing popularity in some ways. Tom mentioned about LGBTQ. You can see that is less popular with gay and bisexual men as it is with the lesbian, bisexual women and gender expansive community. Tom talked a little bit. LGBTQ is, though, increasing in popularity every year. So we don't see a 50% positive rating for gay and bisexual men quite yet, but it is much higher than it was a couple of years ago. And then this new term coming up, LGBT, and then the positive sign, has really yet to catch on with men. It's a little bit more popular with some people out there. It is somewhat problematic with the qualitative work is that the plus sign, which is meant to mean just inclusive of everyone, gay, straight, just everyone who's an ally or part of the community. And although that's a really great statement, at least for men of my generation, I can't get beyond the positive sign symbol, meaning HIV positive. It's just so much part of my experience as a baby boomer man. So you'll find that sometimes older men particularly have some issues with that. So I'm going to go on to the generation slides on these comparisons. And I think what you'll find here is Tom was saying, queer still, I want to say, I think this is really interesting. LGBTQ has a relatively positive rating for millennials, but it falls below 50% for boomers. But that word queer is still mostly negative. But that's partially in the context of the conversation here, because this is about corporate talking to me. And I think queer can be used when it's a gay-on-gay word. And what I mean by that is that if you're a gay bar, you're a lesbian guest house, you're an LGBT media company, use the word queer. It's queer talking to queer. But if a major bank calls me queer, that doesn't sound good to me because that seems like a straight person's calling me queer, and it doesn't work, right? So that's what the qualitative would tell you about the word queer. So a little bit about language matters. I want to bring this up a little bit more. I've talked about some of this a little bit, but again, I would concentrate on LGBT. I'd really concentrate on GLBT as being not okay. Of course, things like sexual preference and alternative lifestyle is not okay. And this is something I really, really want to stress from some of the recent work I did. You got to get this word lifestyle under control in your language. I'm hearing a lot of particularly straight executives within corporations using the word lifestyle to describe the LGBT community, and it's a really, really negative. It's getting into that whole sort of religious right concept of like, part of the gay lifestyle, whatever that means. And I think most LGBT people today would say, well, what makes my, my lifestyle alternative and not yours? But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of non-LGBT people that still use the word lifestyle and connected to the LGBT community. It just comes out of their mouth, and it can sound really, really bad. So you got to be real careful of that. And I've talked about some of these other things, but I'd really be overcautious of this word gay because I think it's one of the very big mistakes I'm seeing in communications right now is the overuse of the word gay. And then in the focus groups, the lesbians, the bisexual, the transgender people are really attacking it right now. So you've got to be really careful right now because it's sending a message. All right, some other ways in which we may be different. I think children is a really big way in which we're different. Excuse me about that. One thing that I'm really seeing right now is that if we look at the percentages by gender and generation, we see that LGBT parents are very concentrated in lesbian and bisexual women, particularly in Generation X and increasingly in late millennial right now. The reason I bring this up is not to say that gay and bisexual men don't have children. Obviously they are, but the percentages are nowhere close. And I'm going to tell you how this plays out in real life, is that what I'm finding with a lot of my women research clients is that when they see an ad with two men and who are parents, although they're supportive of that, don't get me wrong, a really common remark I get from them is that, it's always gay men, it's always gay men, it's always gay men in the advertising. If there's one thing that lesbians are doing better is that we're having families more than gay men, and still you use a gay male couple with children. And it can become offensive to the women. So I'm not saying not to use men in family advertising. I'm just saying that you better use both. Because if you just put out an ad with the guys, you're going to get backlash from the women, and I'm going to say deservingly so. The other thing I'm going to want to say is that those that identify as gender expansive and are transgender have children at much higher percentages than gay men do, and sometimes that surprises people. So Within the gender expansive community, there's a lot of families, and that's something to take into consideration. Also, we've been asking about future children, and we asked this question of millennials without children: do you want to have children in the future? And one thing that's interesting here is that men and women are about the same, with slightly behind gender expansive millennials. So I think that's interesting. We'll see where the future goes. While parents are a little bit more concentrated in the women's community today, maybe that will change in 10 years. I don't know. But some of this early research indicates that gay and bisexual male millennials are very interested in having kids, and we'll see where this goes. Grandparents. I think this one's really interesting. Grandparents are often overlooked as an LGBT market segment. So I think one thing that people don't really realize is that a lot of baby boomers in the LGBT community had kids, often with opposite sex, in an opposite sex relationship. And as their children start to have children, they become grandparents. Now, those people that aren't in the travel industry may not know that this whole concept of multi-generational travel is really important right now, and the concept of wealthier baby boomers, because there's so much wealth in the baby boomer generation, of taking their families on vacation or paying a lot for the vacation for their families, is becoming really common. And we find in our research is that multi-generational travel is really, really important within the LGBT community. So we don't think sometimes as the LGBT community being grandparents, but there are good numbers of grandparents out there, and if that makes sense for your product, don't overlook that in the LGBT community. I think another way we're different, and this is really critical, is where we live within the segments. So what's important here to understand is that the LGBT community doesn't necessarily live in the same place. Now, this is a little bit overly broad, but in general, gay and bisexual men are trending a little bit more urban, urban core, while the women's community and the transgender community tends to be more spread out across multiple kinds of communities, like big city, medium-sized cities, small cities, suburbs, rurals. And it's really important. I mean, I think one of the reasons that you have this situation where sometimes, like in San Francisco, I'll go to a major fundraiser in the LGBT community, and it feels like it's 80% men. And sometimes people say, well, where are all the women? Well, it might just be that the women aren't living in central San Francisco, right? The women are more spread out in the suburbs, are more likely to have kids, they're more likely to be in smaller and medium-sized cities. And sometimes we get a weird impression of the LGBT community of being too male if you're a corporate executive, based in a big city who are going to these big city fundraisers. You get a little bit of a warped perception of the LGBT community on a national level. The other thing that I really want to stress here is that particularly the gender expansive community is very broad-based across many different sizes of communities. And this is super important because one of the reasons it is important is that, a lot of big cities have laws that protect transgender individuals. But this is the thing. Most transgender people don't live in the big cities. So it's so important that we have more of a national perspective, or at least a statewide perspective, on guaranteeing the equality of transgender people in the United States. And that's unfortunate because most states are not taking this on. And, of course, there's a lot of issues with the bathroom bills in some states right now. But it's an important thing to point out is that sometimes we stereotype the transgender community as being urban-based when it's clearly not so. All right, so from a consumer market, I'm just going to use this as an example. I'm going to go back to the travel market. So here's a situation when we ask a question, looking back at all your travel over the last few years, what kind of traveler are you? And we give these different kinds of vacation options. Now, in this particular slide, in some ways, we're the same. If we look on the top, like most people, gay or straight, male or female of all ages, we want rest and relaxation on vacation. That's almost the definition of vacation for a lot of us. So that's pretty consistent across the board. But when we start looking at these other areas, we begin to see that, at least in this case, men and women are different. This might seem a little bit stereotypical, but for the women are a little bit more interested than the gay men on things like natural scenery, outdoor active vacations, while the men are a little bit stronger on things like big city energy, LGBT popular destinations, and nightlife. So that kind of dynamic of the consumer segment becomes really important. That if you are San Francisco, a very urban center, you may market differently than, say, a Sedona, Arizona, which is all about, all about nature. You may be in a different place in the way you really want to approach your marketing based on your research there. So that's an example, but what I can say is that when Tom and I are doing research for many, many different kinds of market segments, and we break it out, typically we break it out as male, female, gender expansive, millennial, Gen X, baby boomers, we really begin to see some of the demographic differences and where the opportunities are, and maybe places that aren't worth investing money, or maybe you need to actually try really, really particularly hard in order to move up your numbers in that way. Sometimes those differences reflect the general population numbers when you look at gender and generation. Sometimes they're actually almost opposite. And it's important to get a good sense of that as we go on. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tom now, and he's going to talk a little bit more about diversity within LGBT.
Great. Thank you, Dave. I love the fact that you're not only really knowledgeable about this, but you're also very opinionated. I think everybody on the call really appreciates some of the comments about LGBT inclusive and terminology and so forth. I'm going to touch on a couple questions that have come up, and we're going to hopefully have some time at the end as well. One was about terminologies, the favorability global or for U.S. And terminology will be different in other countries. Of course, in Germany, there are terms for homosexuality and gay and so forth that are different than what we use in English, and same in China and so forth. So I want to emphasize that most of the charts that we're presenting here are from our LGBT community survey. It's available for download, and this is our USA profile. It's not the entire. The entire survey yields about 20,000 participants from over 100 countries around the world. But the majority of them are in the U.S. Secondarily, we have Canada and UK and Australia. We also have good participation in Germany. We did our full China survey. So there are approaches that you can take a look at on our website, but what we're looking at here is specifically the United States. Another question came in about the HRC score. You know, we've heard it come up many times in qualitative work. We were talking, I forget, I think it was about banks and checking accounts at a focus group. And someone literally pulled out their phone, opened up the HRC app, and told us an anecdotal study of himself. And he said that when he and his partner needed to do some renovations, they were trying to decide whether to go to Home Depot or to Lowe's. And they actually pulled out the HRC app and looked at the Corporate Equality Index scores of both and found that Home Depot at the time was an 85 and Lowe's at the time was 48. And he said it was a no-brainer. They went to Home Depot. So we are hearing this. We haven't asked that specifically in a survey, but you can tell from the research that Dave was covering there that internal best practices are very influential in terms of who we do business with. So it's a pretty important resource for the LGBT community as consumers. Another question was about race and how does that impact the study. I'm actually going to be talking about that in just a moment. And we'll get to some of the other questions as time allows. And all of the questions that you ask, even if we don't cover them in the context of this brief time together, will be answered. We will make sure that we send an email back to you or get information follow-up to you. So let's look at diversity within LGBT. We, as I mentioned, prepared a study specifically on the African American LGBT market. And that study was done in partnership with about 20 Black Pride organizations and Black LGBT media. And it's a fascinating read. We cover all kinds of things about issues that are of importance, motivations for purchase, media that's consumed, and so forth. And I think it's really important for literally everybody on the call, if you're looking at LGBT, to understand the diversity within LGBT, and this was a great opportunity to get started doing that. One client that has really embraced the diversity conversation is Visit Philadelphia. We've actually been doing research for them for 13 years. And when they started off, they came up with a great slogan, get your history straight in your nightlife gay, and it really put them on the map. But they realized over time, of course, that diversity within LGBT is important, and they've had us do focus studies more specifically on segments within LGBT. And I think that they're a really great case study of how they've embraced the African American LGBT community, because they found that African Americans and LGBT are a great match for visiting Philadelphia. and they came out with an ad campaign specifically geared toward the African American community. And I think they did it beautifully and tastefully, and I just give kudos to Philadelphia. They're always a little bit ahead of the game. And, you know, they're very ROI focused. ROI, for those who don't know, is return on investment. Back in the 90s when we started doing our work, a lot of companies jumped into the market just because they wanted to. They thought it was a good idea and they should be doing it. And that's fine. But, you know, as budgets get tighter, the focus on return on investment increases. And I think probably just about everyone on this call is looking at a return on investment when you're talking about marketing. You have to. And so in Philadelphia, we're able to compare our LGBT visitor profile to their general market visitor profile. And I know someone previously asked about comparisons to the general market. Often our clients have general market studies, and we're able to ask LGBT-specific questions in our surveys that match their general market questions so that we can do side-by-side comparisons. It's a lot more efficient and cost-effective to do it that way than to run two studies. And so for Philadelphia, we're able to find that for every dollar they invested into LGBT, they got $153 back. And I think, frankly, that is one of the reasons Philadelphia has been consistent in the LGBT market for 14 years. They were able to establish this fact came out probably about 10 years ago, this ROI figure, and they've been at it ever since. We're also able to look at general market versus LGBT, and general market visitors spent an average of $559 per visit. LGBT visitors spent $878 per visit. I think even more fascinating, those LGBTs who were unaware of the ad campaign spent $743 on their visit. Those LGBTs who came to Philadelphia but had seen the ad campaign, and we asked that in the survey, spent more. They spent $1,000 on their visit. So we do vote with our wallets, and we really do reward companies and destinations and organizations that genuinely and explicitly welcome us and reach out to us. And so their goal was to become one of the top 10 LGBT destinations, and through research and great ad campaigns, I think they were pretty successful at that. I mentioned
a couple more questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to just do a couple more questions that relate to the last slide and the next slide. You know, people asked a little bit about marketing for LGBT within ethnicity segments. I think what's really interesting there is it's always alcohol and travel that are first. So we're actually not seeing that too much in segments outside of alcohol and travel, but we're seeing it now in alcohol and travel. So it's really actually sort of new and cutting edge stuff. But as just a side note, a person that's been doing this for 2 decades, whatever is going to start, it's going to be alcohol and travel to start its first. And that's what's happening right now. Somebody also asked what happens if someone identifies as male and maybe transgender or genderqueer. What if they're in multiple categories, and how do we work that with statistics? What we do is we allow people to identify any way they want to identify. And if you identify as a transgender lesbian, you're going to be included as both in the lesbian statistics and the transgender statistics. So we don't force you to be one thing or the other in that case. We'll present it in both categories. And then the last question is it illegal to be gay in China? No, it's not. The Chinese government actually is pretty hands-off on that. It's a pretty traditional society, and it's very family-oriented in LGBT. And that's not to say there isn't discrimination, and there isn't all sorts of free speech concerns sometimes in certain segments within China. But as a government policy in China, people are not – the Chinese government is not either pro or con. They're pretty neutral about the topic. So turning it back over to you, Tom.
Okay, so that leads us to discussing China just briefly. And I'm just touching on these. These resources are available for download. And I really, again, I encourage you to download these reports and review them because there's an enormous amount of information. This is our give back, basically. We do these studies. We don't charge anything for them. We post them to our website because we feel like the entire community and the entire industry grows from knowledge, and research is a great way to help build that knowledge base. So if you think about China, China is the largest LGBT market in the world. And that may sound surprising, but if you think about it, China is the largest everything market in the world. And we feel through our study here that China is an emerging growing, bursting at the seams market segment that if you have an outreach that includes China, or if you're an international business, really look at the LGBT China market. It's something that's really exciting. And so just one little snapshot in terms of international vacations. Typically when we look at the gay and lesbian market in North America or in Europe, we think of it more as male. There's a lot more male-oriented media and a lot more male-oriented products and services that are being pitched out there, or at least being promoted. You know, it's interesting, and also older. I would say the North American and European markets skew older because that's obviously where the money is. But China is kind of the opposite in a lot of ways. More lesbians are out and actively traveling as out and active lesbian couples than gay men. And we also find that the market skews very young. So it's really important, again, to understand the nuance within that concept of LGBT. We can't assume that what applies here in North America or Europe applies in Asia or Latin America or Africa. So be careful. We really encourage you to explore internationally, but do a little bit of homework. In terms of business-to-business opportunities, that's another whole world in its own right, because we're not only consumers, we also go to work. And one thing that we were able to explore with NGLCC was the premise that as LGBT consumers, we are also influential at work when we make purchasing decisions. So that's like a multiplier. We think about maybe Hyatt reaching a gay couple and making them inspired to book a Hyatt hotel, right? But when this employee goes to work and he has a loyalty to Hyatt because of their outreach to the community, they may be booking Hyatt for their corporation for hundreds or thousands of people for a meeting. So this is something that we're exploring. I think it's kind of like looking at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the influence of LGBT beyond our own consumer activities. We've also looked at families. Again, this is our partner, the Greater Fort Lauderdale Visitor and Convention Bureau. They were interested in exploring the opportunities in LGBT family travel. And what's interesting here is just kind of like a call out. Again, there's lots of information in the study itself, is that when a gay couple or a lesbian couple goes traveling, they're very interested and motivated by what's considered LGBT friendly or LGBT welcoming. When they become parents, they're much more influenced by what's family friendly and family welcoming. And that may be no surprise, but they're looking at, are the kids going to be welcome there? Are they, going to have safety? Or are there activities for the kids and so forth? And so looking at those nuances within LGBT and how they apply to families is very important to us right now as families grow. As Dave said, about 50% of all millennials, both male and female, plan to have kids. And so these are a couple ads from the results of the study. Fort Lauderdale, again, they have a fantastic ad agency that looks at the research and interprets it into tremendous ad campaigns like other clients of ours. I mentioned Philadelphia earlier. But a lot of people are coming up with really beautiful campaigns that specify family. And as Dave mentioned, don't just go out there with a gay male couple and their kid, because you're overlooking the vast majority of LGBT families which have female heads of household. And also transgender. Similarly, as with the family market, we did a specific study for Fort Lauderdale about the transgender traveler, and I really commend Fort Lauderdale for that. I mean, of course, they've been saying LGBT for a decade, but they're the first to really step forth and really want to understand the T in LGBT. And so we did a study for them, and then we went in and did training and a press conference specifically around the issues that the transgender community faces when traveling. And a lot of it has to do with, possibly no surprise, identification, going through security checkpoints, not matching up their ID. These are all issues, and they need to be understood and addressed. Of course, we needn't go into the bathroom issue, but that's obviously top of mind. And they were the first destination to include transgender people in LGBT-specific advertising. And what's new actually this month is that they're including transgender models in their general market advertising as well, which I think is phenomenal. So their Hello Sunny campaign was interpreted. Instead of sunny.org, which is their website, LGBT, they changed it to TLGB to really try and emphasize the fact that they get the transgender segment and they really want to welcome transgender people. On their website, if you click on the upper right corner, their website, which is all about the transgender community and resources and so forth, it translates into many languages. You click on German and the whole website becomes German, which again, I just think that they're a great model for how do we do it right out there. So now I'm going to wrap up kind of quickly, just so that we have some time for questions. LGBT within diversity. So what's happening out there is the inclusion of LGBTQ in general market advertising. And if you came to our workshop in 2015 at Out and Equal, you heard us do a whole presentation about this. So I'm just going to sort of touch on it very briefly. Many people have seen these ads. IKEA was really literally the first. They had a gay couple in their general market campaign very briefly, but they did. Volkswagen had what's considered a gay vague ad that was a couple guys cruising around and picking up some furniture. Orbitz included very vaguely someone with the HRC logo on his golf shirt in one of their studies, and there was a bag of golf clubs in the back with a rainbow draped over it. Very briefly, if you aren't really alert, you probably miss it. And then just back to this. So as Dave was mentioning, initially, employment policies really matter to the LGBT community. So let's take a look at who's out there in the corporate world and how they're reaching out to the community. And then we're going to see how they rank. So Target is a great example of doing it right after doing it wrong. They faced a boycott about 10 years ago. We actually came in and did some research for them right away and helped them steer the direction of the company correctly. They ditched gender labels on toys. They ditched requirements on their changing rooms and bathrooms to be more gender inclusive, gender diversity inclusive. Apple, the Shot on Apple campaign included a lesbian couple and their kids. Starbucks, way back in terms of marriage equality for the state of Washington, came out in support, and they flew the rainbow flag over their corporate headquarters during Pride. There's so many great examples, and I encourage you to just do a Google search of, LGBT in general market advertising, or contact us and we'll help you with this. Amazon did their Kindle ad that included the first reference to a husband with a male speaking about his husband. Macy's came out with their ad campaign and really emphasized that they support the Trevor Project. These kinds of things really matter to the LGBT community, as we saw in the research. Wells Fargo, of course, known and loved for their ad campaign that include the lesbian couple and their adoption of a hearing impaired young woman. And it's a tearjerker. If you haven't seen that, by all means, please Google that and take a look at it. You'll be crying at the end. But beyond that, even on their ATMs, out in the public, this is not just the speaking to the choir. Sometimes I go and pull out some money from an ATM anywhere in the country, and I see, explicit LGBT icons and mention of it gets better and so forth. So what that all means, every year in our survey, as I'm wrapping up this section, we ask which companies have done the best job of outreaching to the LGBT community in the past year. And that doesn't just mean advertising, it also means their support of transgender policies and so forth. And this is a write-in question. We don't actually list these companies or show any logos. We just give them 10 blanks. And so this is what's called a recall question and a very powerful approach to research. And this is about 1,500 LGBTs. And so because of Target's work, specifically around transgender inclusiveness, this shot up. I mean, Target was probably in the 20% not too long ago. but because of this survey being fielded right during that campaign of outreach of inclusiveness, they became a strong number one. Apple, as you can see here, because of their inclusiveness, Starbucks because of their inclusiveness, Amazon, Macy's, Wells Fargo. People had to write in the term Wells Fargo, which means that this is probably a small number in terms of the impact that they had. So the reason I did that is, remember all those ads that I showed you, these are the same companies. They came out with a strong public-facing statement of LGBT inclusivity. And I think that, this was during the Obama years. I think that companies that do that during the Trump years, or maybe a year or months, who knows, will even be more appreciated and recognized. And interestingly, we also asked which companies have you boycotted as a result of their anti-LGBT best practices. And you can see Chick-fil-A, Hobby Lobby, and Cracker Barrel. And actually 2 states got written in there too as well, North Carolina and Mississippi. In terms of hotels, most major hotels are outreaching to the LGBT community now. But I want to call out a couple. One is Hilton. We should move forward here. Here we are. Hilton is a call out here because they have this really, I think, kind of sexy ad campaign, but they're not just running it in the gay press. This ad, which I think is kind of pushing the envelope for a major corporation, even in the gay press, they published that ad in Travel and Leisure, which is one of the 2 top-selling general market consumer magazines in the country. And Marriott, as you may know, came out with their Love Travels campaign. They were the first hotel company to use a transgender model in their communications. They were very much out in the public. And so similarly, in terms of hotel ranking, Marriott comes in number 1. We asked similarly which hotel companies have done the best job outreaching. Again, it's a write-in, and Marriott has really grown, and so has Hilton over the past year. So these are just samples of how companies are doing it right. And Disney, I think, is another tremendous example now, including same-sex headed households in their general market commercials. And that's noticed, and it's very much appreciated. So how do we follow up? How do we stay connected? Let's finish up with a few slides here and then use the last 10 minutes for remaining questions as time allows. So first of all, we kind of have a checklist. If you want to be successful in LGBT diversity, in-reach is just as important as outreach. And I think most of the people on this call are already doing their in-reach properly. They're looking at their best practices. They're doing employee training. They're doing employee inclusiveness and diversity internally. But I think now is the time to really leverage those internal strengths to outward-facing communications. So you need to kind of do an assessment of the who, what, when, where, how, and why of your particular product or service with regard to LGBT. There are also communications opportunities coming up. In New York City, we partner with Pink Banana Media to produce LGBT Week. This is what we like to call kind of a mosaic of a variety of conferences and symposia and networking and receptions throughout the week. It's lgbtweek.com. If you're going to be in New York or you're based in New York, you might want to participate in our advertising or new media conferences during that week. We also take our workshops on the road, so if outreach and communications and research is of interest to your company, we'd be delighted to come there and sort of do similar to what we just did, but a little bit more in depth and focused. Of course, continue your connection with Out and Equal. We're long-time and big-time supporters of Out and Equal. We always feel that in-reach is first before outreach, and Out and Equal is obviously the resource for that. The National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce is also a great connection, specifically around B2B, business-to-business opportunities. Of course, the Human Rights Campaign is an awesome resource that supports all of our issues. So we really do encourage getting out there, getting involved. These are just a few of many awesome organizations out there. The more you can become involved, the more authentic you are, the more genuine you are, and the more connected you are. Again, I started off with this. If you're interested in downloading this presentation, any of the research reports that we referenced, or any ways that we can work together, or if you have specific follow-ups that we didn't get to address in our conversation here, please feel free to send an email, tom@cmi.info. And thank you again to Out and Equal for the opportunity to have this conversation. I'll turn it back over to you, Pat.
Great job, and we've got a lot of questions that have come in. I guess I want to ask kind of a general question. A lot of them are about how do you do this and how do you figure out where your company is. And for companies that are just kind of starting into this marketing aspect, what's some of the suggestions of where to go besides using the resources? But who do they talk to? How do they get the company on board?
Well, I think this is Dave responding to that one. I think it's really important to really focus in on your in-reach and outreach. So first of all, in-reach, getting connected with Out and Equal and really understanding to make sure that your company is LGBT, fully and completely LGBT friendly, and all your employees are ready to serve LGBT people before you start any kind of marketing campaign, because that's always a mistake to not do that first. And second, research is really important. I know that's sort of what we do, but I can't emphasize that enough, is that if you're just throwing some LGBT ads in the LGBT media with no research reference point, who knows if that's going to be effective. Even if you need to not advertise for a year to do the research first, know what you're doing, and do an intelligent outreach response.
That sounds great. And I know kind of keeping up on what's in and what's out, we had some questions about, what about using the rainbow, and how do I move my company into moving Q? So can you talk a little bit how companies have maybe used that research to kind of update their look and feel of their marketing?
Well, it's interesting. I think go ahead, Tom.
Okay, well, there was one question came in that, is there research on whether leaving the Q off can make a company seem out of touch with current nomenclature? And, it really depends on who you're talking to. And Dave may want to elaborate on this. And again, I encourage you to download our survey that's available on our website. It's free. Take a look at it, because we studied exactly that. And we look at generations and we look at genders specifically around their reaction to the Q. And I'm going to emphasize that if you're trying to be all things to all LGBT, I really feel like LGBT is the term to stick with, at least for now, because the Q is actually still kind of offensive to some. I remember when Huffington Post moved from their section of LGBT voices to queer voices, they got a real backlash from a lot in the community who felt that the queer and the Q is really just not appropriate and doesn't speak to them. So I would be really kind of careful and cautious about the Q at this point. Dave, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. It depends on your consumer. If you're a really large corporation, broad-based, we recommend LGBT still at this time. It has much higher positive ratings. If you're a program that really is concentrating in urban cores, hipper places, LGBTQ may be the way to go. It depends on your product, but the basic favorability ratings on the community as a whole still has LGBT quite a bit higher favorable than LGBTQ. So we don't necessarily recommend changing it unless there's a reason to do that, and that reason may be to impress millennials, and that's not a bad reason.
Right, and I think you talked a little bit about the fact of, kind of tailoring that, but thinking about globally. I mean, there's a lot of different messaging in each country. Is there some guidelines you can think about what to check if you're going to try to take this ad into another country?
Yeah, even the LGBT is interesting. Like in Europe, using the I is very, very popular. And if you don't use the I on a European ad, you can actually be seen as being somewhat disconnected. And I think that's really interesting, because still in the United States, you rarely see the I in the alphabet. So you do need to connect with what's going on.
Right?
Right. So you really need to connect with what's happening in that country. You can't assume what's happening in America is the same what's happening in other countries, because it's often not.
And I think a good way to get started is to just Google some of the media that's in that country. So if you're going to be outreaching to Germany or Spain or Argentina, look at some of the LGBT websites there and start to get a sense for how they position LGBT.
Excellent. And we've got a couple more kind of general questions which we can always answer in a blog form or send off to let folks know. But I want to give you both a chance to make some closing comments and some highlights to kind of wrap that up a little bit. So, Tom, why don't you go ahead and go first?
Yeah, happy to. I hope if there are any takeaways from this, and hopefully there are many, many, it is that diversity should include LGBT. I think everybody on this call is, you're the choir, so I don't really need to tell you that. But you can emphasize that to your teams back at work, that LGBT really does need to be part of the diversity conversation in any corporation or organization and deserves the same attention, amount of research, amount of dedicated communications, website, and so forth. And also that there is no LGBT market or LGBTQ market, that we really are a spectrum. And the most successful companies out there, from our perspective and observation, are those companies who get the diversity within LGBT and are very committed to speaking to those segments almost in a dedicated way. Dave, anything else?
I would close is that you really need to give your employees the resources to work with your new LGBT consumers that you are hopefully gaining through your outreach. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people in different levels in corporate America that feel like they have a really great LGBT program, and they know that, say that, that you're in a pride parade or you have ads, but they never get any information about what makes the LGBT community maybe different than the straight community. And some of those nuances can be super important depending on your product, but a lot of times the employees don't have that knowledge. You're not giving them that knowledge. So share the research that you do. Sometimes the research doesn't go far beyond just like the marketing executives. It needs to go farther down in your organizational structures.
Excellent. And thanks to both of you. The amount of data in there, we were all writing quickly. So again, we'll be sending the slides and the recording out, and definitely the cmi.info is a great way to go. This is just a sample of some of the workshops that happen at the summit. We hope that this will encourage you to come join us in Philadelphia on October 9th through 12th. For this year's summit coming up. You will get a short survey at the end of this call, so please make sure that you give us your feedback and responses and ideas of other information that you want to see. The last of our virtual summit series will be on February 28th, which is why your inclusive ERG, who is your inclusive ERG excluding with Deloitte. That'll be at noon Pacific. And again, if you have any questions or are interested in doing more work and digging deeper into these areas and develop some training or consulting, please contact us. And so thank you very much. We will see you in about a week and a half. Thanks a lot.